Good evening, dear Medyascope viewers. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. This evening, our guest will be economist Atilla Yeşilada. We'll be talking about the current state of the Turkish economy, the effect of possible sanctions by the US, the socio-economic impact of the pandemic, as well as practical steps the government should take in order to restore confidence in the lira, as well as fight more effectively against the pandemic, which continues to spread and take lives. But first, let's take a look at this week's developments. Disputes on secularism and Islam have been on a sharp rise between France and Turkey. This month's distress continues following the battle of words between the presidents, the murder of a French teacher, and a French cartoon mocking President Erdogan.
Tensions have been escalating since the beginning of October when the French President Macron described Islam as a religion in crisis and called for strict laws to tackle the issue of Islamist separatism in France. On October 16, a French teacher named Samuel Paty was murdered by an 18-year-old Russian-born refugee of Chechen descent. Samuel Paty was beheaded after a lesson on freedom of speech, where he showed his class Charlie Hebdo cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. The French government recognized this as an act of terrorism by Islamic extremists. While French President Macron delivered his eulogy at Paty's funeral, he said that France would never give up its liberties or cartoons. As a response, Turkey condemned Macron's attitude towards Muslims, as did several Arab countries. President Erdogan further criticized Macron for condoning cartoons that mock Islam, questioning the state of French president's mental health. In accordance, many countries, including Turkey, called for a boycott of French products. The French presidency announced calls to boycott French products to cease immediately, adding that such attacks are the results of a radical minority. In accordance, France recalled its ambassador to Turkey for consultations, an unprecedented move in French-Turkish diplomatic relations. Political expert opinion proposes that such a move could add further economic ramifications to the rising diplomatic stress. Further escalating tensions, the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo featured a mockery cartoon of Erdogan on its October 28th cover. As a response, the Turkish government opened up an investigation to Charlie Hebdo for insulting the president under the Turkish law. Erdogan's spokesman İbrahim Kalın said that the despicable images were the latest example of Macron's anti-Muslim agenda. Erdogan commented on October 28 that Western countries are attacking the Muslim world. By depicting Islamic values in their satirical cartoons, they are aiming to relaunch the Crusades. On the other hand, France characterized the Turkish responses regarding the Charlie Hebdo cartoon to be hateful. Regarding the global perspective on the ongoing tension between France and Turkey, The Guardian newspaper referred to it as being beneficial for both leaders in an article published on October 26. Professor Dr. Ahmet İnsel evaluated this inference on an exclusive Medyascope broadcast. Yes, it is beneficial to both sides in different aspects. For Erdogan, there is a serious economic distress in the country, and he can use this tension to create an Islamic and nationalist solidarity that will distract the public from the economic problems. And for Macron, his stance against Erdogan helps his struggle to not lose his voters in the upcoming elections, as there is a rising wave of right-wing sentiment in France.
According to the daily figures provided by the Ministry of Health, the death toll from the coronavirus across Turkey as of October 29th is 10,099. The official death toll of the country has been questioned by doctors' organizations and opposition politicians. The Turkish Medical Association previously stated that the ministry was not counting the deaths of those who received COVID-19 treatment but died without a positive PCR test. As for the confirmed number of coronavirus patients, the number has reached 370,832. Just a reminder that when it comes to the number of positive coronavirus patients in Turkey, Minister Koca had admitted on September 30th that the ministry excludes asymptomatic cases from its daily count and announces the number of patients.
In a press conference held in Istanbul on October 28th, Koca raised the alarm about a 62% weekly surge in the number of COVID-19 cases in Istanbul, the most populated city in the country. Listing several districts that have seen a surge of over 100%, Koca said that about 40% of the cases in Turkey were reported in Istanbul. He called on the residents of Istanbul who have tested positive for the virus to accurately report their contacts to the affiliation teams. Don't go out unless you absolutely have to, he said. postpone non-essential celebrations and ceremonies. This stage requires discipline. If we don't control the situation in Istanbul, the pandemic will no longer be manageable, the minister further warned. The minister urged citizens to strictly continue wearing masks, maintain their social distance, and pay attention to hygiene. However, when asked if the government is considering re-implementing travel restrictions or weekend curfews on a regional basis, Koca said that such measures are currently not on the agenda. According to a new regulation issued by the Ministry of Health on October 27, medical personnel in both public and private institutions will not be allowed to quit their jobs during the coronavirus outbreak. The ministry has also suspended annual leaves or unpaid leaves for healthcare personnel during the pandemic. In response, the Turkish Medical Association released a statement on its official Twitter account, which read, "When COVID-19 is still not being recognized as an occupational illness at the 8th month of the pandemic, when healthcare staff are not being tested for COVID-19 on a regular basis, it is unacceptable that their leaves and resignations are prevented." On October 24, Istanbul Metropolitan Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu announced he has tested positive for the virus. In a video released from the hospital, İmamoğlu stated the following: "Yesterday evening around 9 p.m., I got a fever and with a temperature of 38 degrees. I came and spent the night in hospital. My COVID-19 test came out positive. My treatment process has started. My health situation is currently good. I thank everyone who have shown their care. I love you all very much." In the video, İmamoğlu also urged everyone to pay attention to COVID-19 measures and minimize physical contact.
We at Medyascope wish Mr. İmamoğlu a quick recovery. The Turkish lira further lost its value on October 27th, trading at 8.1 liras on the dollar, despite repeated state intervention for months. Yet the governor of the central bank and the Turkish Statistical Institute remain optimistic in relation to the economic developments awaiting Turkey.
The central bank on Wednesday raised the year-end inflation forecast for both this year and next. The year-end inflation rate is expected to hit 12.1% for 2020, up from 8.9% in its previous report, the central bank governor said in presenting the latest inflation report. Murat Uysal said the figure will fluctuate between 11.1 and 13.1% through the end of the year. The upward revision was driven by the higher course of exchange rates, output gap, and food prices. Moreover, Turkey's economic confidence index climbed 4.8% month-on-month in October to 92.8 points, recording its sixth straight month of recovery from lows caused by measures to combat the coronavirus. The index was up from 88.5 in September, the Turkish Statistical Institute said. The index, which points to an optimistic outlook when above 100 and pessimistic when below, last stood about 100 points in March 2018.
Good evening, Mr. Yeşilada. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Always love to be on Medyascope.
It's great to have you. So the Turkish lira further lost its value this week on October 27th, measuring more than 8.2 liras on the dollar. And I think this has been going on for quite some time now. What is happening to the Turkish lira and what is causing this loss of value?
I think it's largely sentimental and driven by the mistakes made by the government. The fair value of dollar to TL is something around 750. So anything beyond that is excessive and reflects factors that don't have much to do with the Turkish economy. The rhetoric against the West, where most investors are, is one of the main reasons. I mean, this is not to blame President Erdogan or the AKP administration, but constantly picking up fights with Macron, EU, United States, inviting sanctions. Fund managers live in these countries and they understand they are not welcome in a country like Turkey. Secondly, Turkey's interest rates are too low given inflation. In fact, the real negative, the real interest rate, which is the nominal interest rate less the going rate of inflation, is negative, which means that for a person like me, keeping my money in Turkish lira deposits simply leads to an erosion of wealth. As a result, we have massive dollarization. Amidst this dollarization, what escapes notice is the capital flight. There is an item in the balance of payment statements called errors and omissions. That is the amount of money that comes into Turkey or that goes out of the system for which central bank has no data. Usually, Turkey's errors and omissions account yields a huge surplus. That's because a lot of Turkish business people who keep their money abroad for legitimate reasons send it home when their companies need funding. But over the last year, I think we roughly lost $15 billion through that account, which is either money going abroad because Turks are afraid that the banking system will collapse, or people taking their money out of the banks and putting it into vaults. And finally, of course, the most recent episode, which carried dollar TL above 8 and continues even today, is driven by this silly, nonsensical new economic theory called the comparative exchange rate, which amounts to, well, we're going to let Turkish Lira depreciate wherever it goes because that makes our exports more competitive. And moreover, since Turkey is so cheap, there is going to be a lot of foreign direct investment. This is ignorance to the point of being silly. Export competitiveness has nothing to do with the value of a currency. It has something to do with productivity and the ability to absorb technology. Whereas FDI, foreign direct investment, is not necessarily related to labor costs, but to the fact that you have a regulatory system that's foreseeable, that you have a government that's reliable, and you have independent judiciary. We have none of which. So we're trying to attract, it's sort of like you're selling rotten tomatoes, but you're advertising it by saying, look, we're selling at a 30% discount to other stalls in the open market. So obviously none of this work. And Turkey is rapidly inching towards what we call a currency crisis or balance of payments crisis. But you see me smiling because I'm fairly sure soon the central bank will be forced to hike rates by a massive 600, 700 basis points, and the Turkish lira will appreciate again.
Thank you, Mr. Yeşilada, for summarizing some of the reasons for the loss of the Turkish, loss of value of the Turkish lira. You mentioned as one of the factors the increased geopolitical tensions and the threat of U.S. sanctions as putting pressure on the weakening lira already. We know that this is actually on the table because Turkey tested the Russian S-400 defense system recently, and as a response to this potential these potential sanctions, President Erdogan has said, you do not know who you are playing with, go ahead with your sanctions. So what could happen if the US actually goes through with these sanctions?
Well, first of all, the sentence you quoted from Mr. Erdogan exemplifies our diplomacy and why we're making so many enemies across the world. Mr. Erdogan may be justified in not fearing any sanctions, but to defy United States or any other ally and invite them to slap sanctions is completely undiplomatic. I mean, he could have said, well, we have a certain strategy which fits our national interests, and S-400s are part of those. We wish United States would consider that before imposing sanctions. Now, of course, Mr. Erdogan is not earnest. He has always been flexible in terms of negotiations. The latest example of which is when the EU leaders threatened to impose sanctions on Turkey, Turkey pulled its exploration ships to the port under some excuse or other. If Trump is elected, the chances of any sanctions being slapped on Turkey are fairly low. But I don't think even Trump can resist the congressional pressure if Turkey operationalizes the S-400 systems, because these run against the rules and conventions of NATO, as well as against the spirit of our alliance with the West, broadly speaking. Biden, if elected, is not going to start with sanctions against Turkey, even though the Congress desperately wants to punish Turkey. I think Biden needs Turkey if he wants to push back Russian and Iranian influence in the region. So the first attempt would be to contact Mr. Erdogan and to see whether a compromise can be reached. If Mr. Erdogan refuses to compromise on S-400s and a host of other issues, then CAATSA sanctions will be levied. And obviously, I'm not a judicial scholar. I cannot comment on the Halkbank case in that regard. But yesterday, a new article in New York Times explained how the Trump administration played interference to delay the judgment there. If that judgment is against Halkbank, we're talking about potential fines reaching up to $10 billion, for which the Turkish Wealth Fund, I think they own Halkbank now, would be liable if Halkbank couldn't pay. So that's a serious threat. As I've said, what Biden is not going to mess with Turkey for the next 3 to 6 months. He has a lot to do at home. But this constant sniping in the press, which makes it to the headlines of Financial Times and Bloomberg, etc., scares investors and makes them very unwilling to invest money into Turkey. Finally, Mr. Erdogan should remember what happened when we refused to release Pastor Brunson in August of 2018. It wasn't foreign investors who necessarily sold, some of which did, but it was Turkish retail investors who queued in front of bank branches to pull their money out of the banking system. And after 3 business days, he capitulated and sent Pastor Brunson back. So I think he would remember those lessons and would reach a compromise with Biden about S-400s and other issues. But as long as this defiant tone continues, not only against the United States, but against all of our political allies, what we call investor sentiment, both at home and abroad, is going to be extremely negative and negating any efforts by the government to stabilize the currency or the economy.
So a potential way of restoring confidence to the Turkish lira is by easing these international tensions, and in that way also easing, the fund managers into coming back to Turkey?
Some of these diplomatic tensions, or many of them, are real. We have a serious problem with EU not recognizing our rights in Cyprus or in the continental shelf of Aegean Sea and beyond. I can give other examples as well. And S-400s, I mean, if Turkey thinks S-400s are the best anti-missile weapon, United States need to take that into consideration. I am not arguing with the AKP government's choices in diplomacy. I'm arguing with the undiplomatic and extremely rude rhetoric that accompanies by it. Diplomacy is an alternative to war, but our diplomacy essentially invites a war of words. We can solve all of these problems behind closed doors, what diplomacy is good for, and in the meantime, preserving a positive sentiment in the markets for investors and Turkish retailers. So what we need to do is not necessarily change our diplomatic stance or policies, but to tune down the rhetoric, to speak to people on friendly and civilized terms.
I'd like to also talk about the pandemic, Mr. Yeşilada. Now, no doubt the pandemic has had a huge negative impact on the global economy. And we can see kind of around the world, the central banks having taken radical actions. How do you evaluate the measures taken by Turkey during this time? And are they sufficient, especially in terms of the guarantees and support they provide to the wider populace? I mean, the pandemic isn't over yet. And it seems that, we still have quite a bit of a struggle ahead of us. So how do you foresee the next couple of months in terms of the direct impact it will have on the Turkish population?
First of all, the distinction made by the health ministry between cases and patients is silly, because a case is a COVID positive person running around the streets, kissing and hugging his friends or her friends and relatives and spreading the disease. We have, as of yesterday, 2,300 patients. According to estimates by medical experts I find reliable, the actual cases, that super spreaders, could be 3 to 10 times higher than the active patients, which would give you something like 7,000 to 20,000 cases, and it would make Turkey as bad as France almost. The European governments have long resisted shutdowns, lockdowns, curfews, whatever you call them. But finally they relented because a vaccine is not coming, not anytime soon. And unfortunately, humans are herd animals. They can't live in isolation. So it must be the state edict that prevents them from mingling. I don't think Turkey's fate will be very different. I think in a month or so we'll start curfews and then lockdowns. The economic cost of that is going to be massive, simply because in the meantime, Turkey's budget essentially went bankrupt. The measures were completely ineffective and insufficient in the sense that the presumed 500 billion Turkish liras doled out in terms of state support were 80% loans, and loans need to be repaid. Now they are coming due. But in the meantime, neither the individuals nor the companies could generate the turnover to pay back these loans. Now we're in a situation where we really need hard cash to help ease poverty, unemployment, and also to add to the budget of the healthcare system, which is extremely exhausted and on the verge of collapse. But unfortunately, the Treasury has no cash left. So I think the winter is going to be tough, but I'm not very pessimistic. There are means to overcome, to reduce the impact of the epidemic on the population. One of which is for central bank to print money and to give it directly to the government, which should be used on the population as cash injections. We shouldn't try to ascertain whether people are really unemployed or deserving of unemployment compensation. We should pay money to any applicant and ask questions later, because that's not only helping the applicant, but he or she gains purchasing power, which helps the services industries, which would otherwise be shut down completely. And in addition to recession and poverty, we would also deal with a chain of bankruptcies. And once these companies shut down, they won't come back because they are all undercapitalized and run by small-time entrepreneurs who have really exhausted their means.
It's actually reassuring to hear you say that you are not pessimistic and that there are practical solutions that the government can take to kind of ease the situation for the general population.
I think there are also other measures. IMF has facilities, unconditional facilities, to help with the hardship caused by COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. World Bank has facilities, and we really need to raise interest rates because the health crisis by itself is a massive psychological and real burden on the society. If we add on top of that a currency crisis, I think the problems will go beyond the realm of the economy and spread to the politics. I mean, we see protests in Italy, in South American countries, India, etc., etc., and that would be disaster for the people of Turkey.
Mr. Yeşilada, thank you so much for having joined us this evening.
It has been my pleasure. I hope to be hosted again in your program. Good luck to you.
I hope so too. Thanks.
Istanbul has become the latest stop of the French artist Saip's Beyond Walls project. This land artwork will be open for exhibition in early November and will invite people to mutual aid, kindness, and to live together.
Known as Saip, the French land artist Guillaume Legros paints frescoes on the grass with the biodegradable paint that he invented. Under the aim to shed light on the common bonds shared by humanity, Saip paints interlace hands in different cities of the world. Through his lens, Saip underlines that the walls in our minds are fictive partitions. The French artist aims to pass through 30 cities of the world to symbolically create the largest human chain in the world. Unsatisfied from the polarization and alienation that the world faces today, Saip thinks that art is a crucial tool in communication. Among his reasons to designate Istanbul as his 8th stop, Saip underlines Istanbul's geopolitical importance, which symbolizes the project's reflection of different cultures and people meeting together. 3 frescoes have been painted in Istanbul at Boğaziçi University, the Golden Horn of the Bosphorus, and in the Beykoz district. The photo exhibition of the frescoes opened to the public on October 26 at Taksim Art Gallery and can be visited until November 8.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.